Welcome aboard the dark waters of the Night Crew podcast, where true crime meets the unknown. Each month we dive into the eerie, the unsolved, and the stories that haunt the shadows. If it's creepy, mysterious, or just plain unsettling, you'll find it here. So light your lantern, step onto the deck, and prepare to uncover what lies beneath the surface.
This podcast contains discussions of true crime, disturbing content, and mature themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is strongly advised. The Night Crew podcast aims to present stories with respect to the victims and their families, and the intent is never to sensationalize tragedy, but to shed light on the unknown and unexplained. Hi everyone, welcome to episode 14 of The Night Crew. We are 59 days away from Halloween, and today I'm going to be focusing on the Fritzl case. 24 years in the cellar. I believe I watched a movie about this a few years ago. It's called Girl in the Basement, and there's also other movies that I'm going to attach underneath the video as well, so that you can see the documentary, see what happened in real time. But for now, I will be talking about what happened within those 24 years. Some of the darkest true crime stories feel almost too horrific to be real. But what I'm about to tell you is not fiction. It happened in a quiet Austrian town behind the doors of a seemingly ordinary home. For 24 years, a father kept his own daughter locked in a cellar. She lived in darkness, gave birth to 7 children, and endured unimaginable abuse. This is a story of the Josef Fritzl case, a story that shocked the entire world. So now I'm going to go into the background of Josef Fritzl. He's the bad guy in the story, as you will come to know. So, before we dive into the horrors of Josef Fritzl's crimes, it's important to understand who he was and where he came from. Because monsters like Fritzl aren't born in a vacuum. There's always a beginning, and sometimes those beginnings plant seeds that grow into something unthinkable. Josef Fritzl was born in 1935 in the small Austrian town of Amstetten. His father abandoned the family when he was still a boy, leaving Josef in the sole care of his mother, Maria. And Maria wasn't exactly a warm, nurturing mother figure. Accounts from neighbors and people who knew the family described her as strict, cold, and often abusive towards her children. Josef himself would later admit that his mother beat him regularly, humiliated him, and controlled nearly every aspect of his life. In his words, she was the best woman in the world, but psychologists later pointed out that this was a twisted way of abuse, using abuse with love, essentially. It's a survival mechanism, and it warped Joseph's view of women forever. He grew up in a house where violence was normal, control was absolute, and affection was conditional. And somewhere in that environment, Josef developed an obsession, not just with sex, but with domination. By his early 20s, that obsession had already crossed dangerous lines. In 1967, when Josef was just 32 years old, he was convicted of rape. The victim was a young nurse, and the attack was brutal. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison, though he only served 12. What's chilling is that when he got out, the world largely forgot about that conviction. He blended back into the community, got married, and seemed to live a normal life. Which is ridiculous. I don't know how he got away with 12 months. I don't know if he got parole after that, but that is just not enough time for raping a woman. That is just, they should get at least 20 years, if not life. But anyways, back to the story. But behind closed doors, Josef Fritzl was cultivating his dark impulses. He married Rosemary, who by all accounts was quiet and submissive, a perfect partner for a man who craved control. They had children, built a respectful life, and neighbors saw Josef as strict but successful. Nobody suspected the twisted fantasies that were brewing in his mind. What made him truly dangerous wasn't just his childhood or his earlier crimes. It was his intelligence and meticulous planning. Josef was an engineer. He knew how to build, how to design, how to manipulate his environment to fit his secret needs. And it's this skill set combined with his lifelong obsession with domination that led to his ultimate crime, the creation of a hidden world beneath his home, a dungeon that he alone controlled, designed to hold his daughter Elisabeth as his prisoner, his possession, his victim, for the next 24 years. So, was Josef Fritzl a product of his abusive childhood? In part, yes. But psychologists who studied him during his trial were clear. Abuse alone doesn't create someone like Fritzl. He had what they described as a severe combined personality disorder. He was a narcissist, antisocial, and sadistic. He wanted power and he wanted secrecy. His childhood gave him the blueprint, but Josef built the nightmare himself. The Prisoner in the Cellar. By the mid-1980s, Josef Fritzl had created the perfect mask. A respectful Austrian family man. He was a husband, a father, a property owner, even somewhat respected in the community. People knew him as strict, yes, but they never knew he was dangerous. Behind that mask, though, Fritzl was already working on something monstrous. In 1978, years before the crime that would shock the world, Josef began secretly constructing a hidden cellar beneath his family home. He got planning permission for a basement, but what he actually built was far more elaborate. A bunker-like series of rooms sealed off from the outside world. Only he knew about the extra hidden chambers, and only he had the keys. Neighbors thought he was just eccentric, always tinkering with projects. But what he was really doing was building a prison beneath his home. So now we fast forward to August 1984. Elisabeth Fritzl, Josef's daughter, had just turned 18. Like many teenagers, she wanted freedom. She wanted to live her own life, and Josef wasn't about to let that happen. One day, he asked Elisabeth to help him carry a heavy door down to the cellar. She agreed, thinking it was just another one of her father's projects, but once she stepped inside, everything changed. Josef overpowered her, drugged her, and locked that heavy door into place. That door became the final piece sealing Elisabeth away from the world. From that moment forward, she was gone. To the outside world, Josef claimed Elisabeth had run away. He even went so far as to produce forged letters, supposedly written by her, saying she had joined a cult. Police didn't investigate too deeply. After all, she was 18, legally an adult. And Josef played the concerned father convincingly. Ridiculous. I just can't believe they didn't investigate it further. But the truth was far darker. Elisabeth was trapped in a cramped, windowless cellar about 600 square feet total. It had a makeshift bathroom, a small sleeping area, and some storage space. The ceilings were low, the air was stale, the rooms were completely soundproof, and every door, every passage was controlled by Josef. Elisabeth wasn't just in prison, she was entombed. And this wasn't a temporary punishment or even a crime of passion. This was Josef Fritzl's plan all along. He wanted Elisabeth completely under his control, body, mind, and soul. And for the next 24 years, that cellar became her world. At first, Elisabeth fought back. She screamed, begged, pleaded for release, but no one heard her. The cellar swallowed her crimes. Fritzl would come down, sometimes with food, sometimes with threats, sometimes with violence. And over time, Elisabeth realized the horrifying truth. No one was coming to save her. This was her life now, and it would only get worse, much worse. And now I'm going to be talking about life in the cellar for Elisabeth. After the door closed in 1984, Elisabeth Fritzl's life became a waking nightmare. At first, her world was nothing but darkness, silence, and fear. But within months, Josef's twisted plan escalated. He didn't just want Elisabeth hidden, he wanted her under his complete control. And that meant repeated sexual assaults. Night after night, Josef came down the cellar, locking the door behind him, and took what he wanted from his own daughter. Within the first few years of her captivity, Elisabeth became pregnant by her father. And this is where the horror deepens, because Josef didn't stop. Over the course of 24 years, Elisabeth gave birth to 7 children in that cellar. Think about that for a moment. 7 children born in darkness, raised in captivity. It's just crazy to think about that she survived that long with them. Oof. But their entire existence was controlled, obviously, by Josef Fritzl. 3 of those children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, stayed with Elisabeth in the cellar their entire lives. They never seen the sun, never felt fresh air, never walked beyond those concrete walls. 3 others, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, were taken upstairs by Josef. He staged it to look as though Elisabeth had left the babies on his doorstep, claiming she couldn't care for them. His wife, Rosemary, absolutely oblivious about everything somehow. Anyways, Rosemary and the rest of the family took these children in, raising them as if they were Elisabeth's abandoned offspring. The deception was so convincing that even Rosemary believed her daughter had joined a cult and was leaving her children behind. That's just how powerful Josef was at manipulating people. I still don't know. I mean, it was soundproof down there, so I guess she didn't hear anything, but it's just so suspicious regardless. The 7th child, sadly, did not survive. A twin boy died shortly after birth in the cellar. Josef disposed of the body in an incinerator, erasing all trace of his existence. This double life, children above and children below, is almost too bizarre to comprehend. Upstairs, Josef was the strict but caring grandfather. Downstairs, he was the jailer, the abuser, and the absolute dictator of an underground world. And Elisabeth? She became both prisoner and mother. She had to raise her children in impossible conditions with no sunlight, no school, no freedom. She taught them to read and write using scripts Josef brought down. How kind of him. She kept them quiet because crying too loud or making noise could bring punishment. And somehow, through sheer strength, she gave those children as much love as she could. That takes so much ability to do that. I just can't imagine raising kids in an underground bunker, essentially, with no sunlight or anything. No outside world. You can't talk to anyone else except them. It just sounds absolutely horrendous. Josef, meanwhile, living his best life, maintained control with a terrifying system of rules and manipulation. He told Elisabeth and the cellar children that the doors were rigged with electricity, and if they tried to escape, they'd be killed. He claimed the world above was too dangerous, that no one cared about them, that even if they screamed, no one would hear. He sometimes cut off electricity or food for days as punishment. Elisabeth later said this was one of the worst tortures because it left them completely helpless. Some of the kids developed serious health and developmental issues due to no sunlight, no socialization, and no fresh air. Elisabeth was forced to give birth without any medical assistance. She had to deliver her own children with nothing but a book Josef provided. I can't imagine giving birth to 7 kids in a completely dark basement with no tools or anything, especially she bled out. You gotta be a strong person for that. That is insane. Joseph acted like he was their only source of survival, bringing food, clothing, and supplies, which created a twisted dependency. Beyond the assaults on Elisabeth, reports from her testimony suggested that Joseph at times forced Elisabeth to watch pornographic videos that he then reenacted with her. So gross. He was also accused of filming some assaults, though no recordings were ever released publicly. I know damn well they found those films of him. I'm sure there were hundreds of them. I mean, 24 years is a long-ass time. Ugh. And for decades it worked. The outside world went on, unaware. Neighbors saw Joseph gardening, taking trips, even hosting barbecues at his own house. Rosemary believed her daughter had abandoned her family. The police accepted Joseph's forged letters. No one suspected that beneath that ordinary suburban home, an entire hidden family was living in the shadows. By the 2000s, Elisabeth had spent over 2 decades underground. Her eldest children, Kirsten and Stefan, were adults but had never left the cellar. The younger ones had no concept of life outside. And Joseph, he was nearly 70 years old, still carrying on as if this arrangement was normal. It's hard to fathom, isn't it? 24 years, almost a quarter of a century of unimaginable control, cruelty, and secrecy. But eventually, something happened that Joseph couldn't control, and that's when the truth finally began to unravel. Kirsten's hospital visit, so she's the daughter. In April 2008, after nearly a quarter of a century underground, the Fritzl case finally began to crack. Elisabeth's eldest daughter, Kirsten, who had been born in the cellar in 1989, was now 19 years old. She had spent her entire life in captivity, never once stepping outside those concrete walls. And by that spring, her health had begun to deteriorate. Kirsten suddenly collapsed in the cellar. She was pale, weak, and soon fell into an unconscious state. Elisabeth knew her daughter's life was in danger, and for the first time in years, she had a bargaining chip against Joseph. She begged him to take Kirsten to a hospital. At first, he refused. Joseph hated anything that could expose his secret, but Elisabeth was desperate. She told him that if Kirsten didn't get medical attention, she would die. Finally, perhaps realizing the risk of having a dead teenager in the cellar, Joseph relented. On April 19, 2008, Joseph carried Kirsten out of the cellar, the first time she had ever felt the air of the outside world. He drove her to the Amstetten hospital and claimed he had found her outside his home. Doctors were horrified. Kirsten was in critical condition, malnourished, weak, and suffering from severe kidney and organ failure. Her teeth were rotting, her skin was pale, and her body showed signs of long-term vitamin deficiency. The medical team immediately began asking questions like, who was this girl? Why did she look so ill and underdeveloped? Why did Joseph seem evasive about her identity? Joseph told them a bizarre story that his daughter Elisabeth had joined a cult years earlier, had left her children behind, and that Kirsten has simply appeared on his doorstep for some odd reason. But the doctors weren't convinced. Thankfully, someone's finally doing something. Kirsten's condition was so severe that they needed medical history, yet Joseph refused to provide any. They issued a public appeal asking the mother of this mysterious girl to come forward. This moment, that public appeal, was a crack in Joseph's perfect little facade. Because Elisabeth saw it on the small television Joseph had allowed in the cellar. For the first time in 24 years, she realized that people outside were questioning Joseph's story, and that meant she might finally have a chance to be heard. For days, Elisabeth begged Josef to let her come forward, to explain to the doctors what was wrong with Kirsten. At first, Josef resisted, terrified that if Elisabeth appeared, the entire nightmare would unravel. But as the hospital and the media applied more pressure, Josef agreed to let Elisabeth write a note explaining Kirsten's condition. The note, however, only raised more suspicion. The hospital staff began quietly alerting the police, who by now had serious doubts about Josef's cult explanation. Finally, Josef made a fateful decision. On April 26, 2008, 1 week after Kirsten's hospitalization, Josef escorted Elisabeth, now 42 years old, out of the cellar for the first time in almost a quarter of a century. She went with him to the hospital to speak with doctors and about her daughter. It was here, in that sterile hospital environment, that Elisabeth finally saw the outside world again. She saw other people. She saw that Josef's lies could no longer hold up. And for the first time in years, she began to imagine the possibility of freedom. Now we're going to go into the police questioning and Elisabeth's confession. So, when Elisabeth walked into the Amstetten hospital on April 26, 2008, it was like stepping into another planet. After 24 years of captivity, the world must have felt overwhelming. The bright lights, the fresh air, the sounds of people talking freely. But despite the shock, Elisabeth's focus was singular, saving her daughter, Kirsten. The doctors, though, were only concerned with Kirsten. They were deeply suspicious of Josef Fritzl's story. Remember, he had claimed Elisabeth was in a cult, that she had abandoned her children, and that the sick girl had simply shown up at his door. But now, here was Elisabeth, suddenly back in public, standing beside Josef, and apparently willing to go along with this bizarre tale. Police had already been notified by the hospital staff, who thought something was seriously off. When investigators arrived, they quickly asked Josef and Elisabeth to come in for questioning. Josef, thinking he could once again manipulate the situation, agreed. At first, Elisabeth did what she had been conditioned to do her entire life. She kept quiet. She stuck to Josef's script, repeating his lies about the cult and pretending that she had returned voluntarily. But the police weren't buying it. They pressed harder. They separated Elisabeth from Josef, the first time she had been apart from him in years, decades. It was in that moment, alone with police, that Elisabeth finally broke. She realized this was her final chance. For years, she had lived under Josef's threats that if she ever told anyone the truth, he would kill her and the children, or that the cellar doors would electrocute them. But now, she was outside with people who could protect her. And for the first time, she saw that Josef wasn't invincible. After nearly 2 hours of questioning, Elisabeth whispered the truth. My father kept me locked in a cellar for 24 years. He is the father of my children. Please help us. The room went silent. Investigators could barely process what they were hearing. But Elisabeth continued, giving chilling details about the secret dungeon beneath her family home, small rooms, the soundproof doors, the years of abuse, and the children who had never seen daylight. Police immediately rushed to the house. Armed with Elisabeth's testimony, they searched the property and found the hidden entrance to the cellar. Behind the metal doors and concrete walls, they discovered the unimaginable. 3 of Elisabeth's children, pale and terrified, staring into the lights of freedom for the very first time. One officer later described the scene as like stepping into a nightmare. The rooms were tiny, the ceilings low, the air stale and damp. Children's drawings were taped to the walls, but everything else was claustrophobic, suffocating. Josef Fritzl was arrested on the spot. For the first time in decades, Elisabeth and her children were free, but the weight of what they revealed would stun the world and turn the Fritzl case into one of the darkest, most disturbing stories of captivity and control in modern history. Media explosion and world reaction. When the truth about Josef Fritzl broke, it wasn't just a local scandal in Austria. It became international news overnight. The story hit headlines around the globe. Newspapers splashed phrases like the House of Horrors and Dungeon Father across their front pages. TV stations ran non-stop coverage and reporters descended on Amstetten, the quiet Austrian town suddenly thrust into the spotlight. People were horrified and fascinated. How could something this monstrous have happened in a modern European town, unnoticed for nearly a quarter of a century? Neighbors who had lived beside Josef for years were stunned. To them, he was a reserved but polite man. Strict, yes, but nothing that screamed monster. He worked as an engineer, owned multiple properties, and even took vacations. He was the last person they would have suspected. The shock deepened when details about the cellar emerged. Elisabeth had been just 18 years old when she vanished in 1984. Josef built the dungeon himself, a labyrinth of narrow, soundproof rooms beneath his home. Over 24 years, Elisabeth bore him 7 children in captivity. 3 of those children grew up underground, never once feeling sunlight until 2008. The media frenzy was relentless. Journalists staked out the hospital, desperate for any glimpse of Elisabeth or her children. The Austrian authorities quickly placed the family under protection, shielding them from the cameras. The public reaction was a mix of horror, outrage, and sympathy. Many compared the case to fairy tales turned dark. Josef was described as a real-life monster hiding in plain sight. And questions swirled. How did his wife not know? Why did no one suspect? How could the system fail so horribly? The case exposed not only Josef's unimaginable cruelty, but also the weaknesses in social systems. The lack of follow-ups on Elisabeth's supposed disappearance, the unquestioned belief in Josef's cult story, and the silence of a neighborhood that never probed too deeply. But as the world reeled, prosecutors in Austria prepared for one of the most chilling trials the country had ever seen. I don't understand how people suspected so much in the house, but they just did not investigate it. This poor girl was in there for 24 years with 3 of her children. Either way, we're going to go into the trial of Josef Fritzl now. In March 2009, less than a year after his arrest, Josef Fritzl's trial began in St. Pölten, Austria. The courtroom was packed with journalists, lawyers, and onlookers, all waiting to hear how a father could do something so monstrous to his own daughter. Josef, now 73 years old, initially tried to appear calm and even dismissive. He pleaded not guilty to murder and enslavement, as though 24 years in the dungeon didn't count as enslavement. But prosecutors laid out the evidence in excruciating detail. They described how Josef systematically raped and abused Elisabeth, fathering 7 children with her. They showed diagrams of the cellar, the tiny windowless rooms, the electric locks, the hidden passageways. They spoke of the 3 children raised underground, their growth stunted by lack of sunlight and exercise. The most horrifying accusation involved the baby known as Michael. He was born in the cellar in 1996, but died just 3 days later. Elisabeth begged Josef to take Michael to a hospital, but he refused. Prosecutors argued that if he had allowed medical care, the baby would have survived. This became the basis for Josef's murder charge, which he wanted to go to the hospital for her, but he went for his other daughter, which is interesting. It kind of seems like he did not really give a shit about his kids at all. So during the trial, Elisabeth herself made a powerful appearance. She did not testify in open court, but provided videotaped testimony that was shown to the jury. In it, she calmly but heartbreakingly recounted the decades of abuse. According to reporters present, Josef kept his head bowed as the tape played. For the first time, he seemed visibly ashamed. Good. Faced with overwhelming evidence in his daughter's testimony, Josef finally cracked. Midway through the trial, he changed his plea to guilty on all charges, including rape, incest, imprisonment, coercion, and neglected homicide for the baby. On March 19th, 2009, Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life imprisonment in a secure psychiatric unit. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, never again controlling another human being. For Elisabeth and her children, it was both an ending and a beginning. They had escaped the dungeon, but rebuilding their lives after 24 years of trauma would be a long, painful journey. Still, with Josef locked away forever, they at least had the freedom he had denied them for so long. Lastly, I will go into the aftermath and life today for the family. After Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life in prison, Elisabeth and her children were finally free physically. Freedom after 24 years in a dungeon doesn't erase trauma overnight. Elisabeth faced the monumental task of rebuilding her life. She had lost decades to captivity, endured repeated abuse, and had children whose entire early lives were spent in a cellar. Psychologists and trauma specialists worked with her to help her process the unimaginable. Her children who grew up in the dungeon, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, faced their own challenges. They had never experienced, again, sunlight, schools, or normal social interaction. Slowly, through therapy and patient care, they learned how to navigate the world above ground. Elisabeth has always emphasized protecting their privacy, shielding them from media attention, and ensuring they could live as normal a life as possible. The children who were raised upstairs by Rosemary Fritzl also struggled with confusion and anger. They had grown up believing their mother had abandoned them, and now they were confronted with the truth. Their father had kidnapped their siblings and their mother. Rebuilding trust and family bonds took years. Elisabeth and her children were eventually given new identities to protect them from media intrusion. They moved to a new location, far, far away from the house where the horrors occurred, and have largely remained out of the public eye. The family rarely speaks publicly, though Elisabeth has occasionally given interviews to emphasize resilience, survival, and the importance of escaping abusive situations. The Fritzl case remains a cautionary tale, a story of how evil can hide behind normality, how one person's obsession can destroy entire lives, and how courage and survival can endure even in the darkest circumstances. Psychologists who studied Elisabeth's recovery say her strength is extraordinary. She managed to provide care, love, and guidance to children who had never known freedom, while also processing decades of abuse. Her story is a testament not only to human cruelty, but to human resilience. Today, Josef Fritzl remains in a secure psychiatric prison in Austria. Elisabeth and her children continue to live in secret, rebuilding their lives far away from the media and public scrutiny. And though the world will always remember the horror of the Fritzl dungeon, Elisabeth's story is also a story of hope, survival, and the power of reclaiming your life, even after the unthinkable. As we wrap up this episode, it's important to remember that stories like the Fritzl case are not just tales of horror. They're also reminders of the strength of the human spirit. Elisabeth and her children endured something almost unimaginable, and yet they survived. They reclaimed their lives slowly but surely, and that is a powerful testament to resilience. For anyone listening who may be facing abuse, manipulation, or control in their lives, there's a message here. You are not powerless. Reach out. Speak to someone you trust. Authorities, hotlines, friends, or support networks. Help exists, and even in situations that feel hopeless, there's always a way towards safety and freedom. It's also a reminder for all of us to pay attention to the world around us. Sometimes the most dangerous people hide behind masks of normalcy. Listening, observing, and trusting our instincts can make a difference, not just for ourselves, but for those who may be suffering in silence. The Fritzl case is horrifying, yes, but it's also a story of hope and survival. Elisabeth and her children rebuilt their lives despite decades of unimaginable trauma, and that's the part of this story we should hold on to. The resilience, courage, and humanity that can survive even in the darkest of circumstances. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Night Crew. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, don't wait. Reach out. Help is closer than you think. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware of your surroundings, and remember, even in the darkest stories, there's always a glimmer of light.